Start. Hello to everyone who's joining us online today, and welcome to our inaugural PRIA Research Community Webinar, which is an initiative of the PRIA's Education Community Committee. My name is Elissa Lewis, and as a member of the ECC, I'm really excited to be hosting today's ResComm session. For those of you who may not be aware, the purpose of ResComm, which was previously known as ACPRES, is to create a forum to facilitate and encourage collaboration within and between PR academics and also those working in practice, with the purpose to really exchange knowledge, explore areas of practice and new and emerging topics in our industry. So really a collaboration forum for academics and practitioners to come together. Our presenter for today's session is Bridget Tombleson. So Bridget is a PR public relations lecturer at Curtin University in WA. She's a communications professional with more than 20 years experience in public relations, media relations, issues management, strategy development, and internal communications. Bridget has worked in government, corporate, and also in consultancy roles, both domestically in Australia and overseas. And across her career, she has developed communication skills in science communication, finance and banking, building and construction, education, and information technology. So she's got a plethora of experience across a whole range of practice areas. She's also been a lead academic and was the co-creator of a massive online open course called Reputation Management in a Digital World through edX. And she was a finalist in 2018 in the edX Prize. Bridget is passionate about transmedia learning and bringing the best of both online and also face-to-face learning together. And today, that's what Bridget will be discussing. She'll be discussing 10 tips for synchronous and asynchronous learning, and some of which have also come from last year's pandemic from COVID-19. So in terms of how we're going to run today's session, the first part of today's session, Bridget will talk through her research and share her learnings with you. And you're all encouraged to participate as she presents during each of the pieces of information she'll be delivering using the chat box. And then at the end of the presentation of her material and learnings, the forum will be opened for discussion. So at that point in time, we encourage you to turn on your cameras, ask your questions, and hopefully we can have a discussion and share ideas and thoughts, and perhaps also your learnings and experiences from your teaching and also from what the pandemic has shared or has focused our learnings on. So over to you, Bridget.
Thanks, Elissa. Hello, everyone. I see we have some people I know and some I don't, so hi to those people that are on. So I just wanted to say, to start up by saying, so this sort of came about from a LinkedIn post article I put up, which would have been in March last year when this all started. And can you believe it's a year? We're coming up to a year when this big mess all started for a lot of us in higher education. And it came about because, obviously, as you all know, there was this huge rush for everything to go online for a lot of things that had traditionally been face-to-face. As you know, public relations, most of us would agree, is a very sort of face-to-face, focused discipline when teaching. And this shift to online sort of, meant that there were a lot of band-aids in the process, people just doing their best, which is absolutely acceptable in the circumstance. So it came from that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and also because my research is in this area. I'm doing my PhD on transmedia learning, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that today. But the 10 tips that I talked about in the article, I've sort of linked them along the way, so I'm going to talk about that. So I'm just giving you a bit of context if you see them. I'm just moving my slides through. So what I want to talk about today is the issue as I see it. So this is my personal opinion, and I'm keen to hear others' opinions on this too, because I think it's an area that should been much discussed, and is an area still where many people are growing their expertise. So I'm sure some of the stuff I'll tell you, you might think, oh yeah, of course I know that. Some of them might be new, but other people might have new ideas to share. And that's the point of this, is it's not heavy in theory at all. It's very practical, because I want sort of people to take ideas and actually be able to go away and use them. And that is the hope of my PhD. It's a very practical PhD. So the issue I'm going to talk about online learning, and these are the terms I do want to talk about, because there's so many terms being bandied around with not much thought really given to what they actually mean, and a lot of them are being used interchangeably when they're not actually the same terminology. So I want to talk about online learning, I want to talk about blended and flipped learning, I want to talk about concurrent teaching, and then I want to talk about transmedia learning, and they're all quite different things. So just sort of giving a bit of more context and understanding around what each one is, and then a little bit into the findings of my research. Moving my slides. So just a little bit info there that Alyssa already gave you, so I won't dwell too much on that. So if anyone has any questions along the way, please feel free to put them in the chat box too, because I think sometimes it's best to address along the way, but we can also discuss at the end. So the issue that happened, I think, was the rush to head online made too many assumptions, and I think created a lot of issues along the way, some of which were ironed out, some of which are still being ironed out. But they're really important issues to think about, and I think the big one I've put up first. And the big one was that face-to-face content can just be put up online without any thought to the instructional design of it. So essentially, that's what a lot of educators were told, was to take their content and put it online. And that meant, you know, sometimes a 2 or 3 hour Zoom session, essentially, in place of what would have been a tutorial or a seminar. And it is, the two don't equate, and we're going to talk about that. So online instructional design is very different to face-to-face, and you can't just sort of replicate one for the other. There was also an assumption of availability, so technological, you know, that everyone had the same bandwidth, IT access, you know, systems. And this is a big one, because if any of you have or are teaching, particularly students in China, you'll find availability is definitely a big issue, particularly even platform access, different platforms is a big issue. So that assumption just cannot be made, even for the learning management systems that the universities have. They cannot always get access, they cannot always download the videos, even if it's through the official channels. So there's still a big problem there, even in 2021. The next one is similar but different. So the assumption of availability in time. Obviously, COVID-19 placed increased pressures on many students that might have had children, or might have lost their jobs, or, you know, might have been under high anxiety pressure because of, you know, parents that were sick or they couldn't get access to. I mean, there's a whole lot of issues surrounding that that I think some of us have had to deal with as well. And then the big one here, which was massive, and this is what some of my research that we're going to talk about today also discusses, is the assumption of the knowledge in the use of platforms, the myth of the digital native, that they just know how to use these platforms, and particularly so in terms of the confusion of the number of platforms. So hopefully people are nodding their heads, but, you know, some people are using WebEx, some people were using Blackboard Collaborate Ultra, some people were using Zoom, some people were probably using other platforms. And I know in our own university, we had Blackboard Collaborate Ultra, we had iLectures, we had WebEx. So just those 3 official platforms in itself, students didn't quite always comprehend that they were actually unique and distinct platforms. And they did get confused. So there's this assumption too that the students just know how to use the technology, when that is not always the case, and there's a need for upskilling there. Also, the big one, because I'm going to talk about building communities online, when we have face-to-face classes, there's that osmosis of working in groups and being together and, forming those collaboration partnerships, in class. And you can't replicate that, in a hangout or a dropout session, or, even if you've got them working in different groups, it is just not the same online, and you have to build communities differently. So that requires a lot of work too. And when you look at these, what have I got? 5 points there, and some of those points are pretty big issues, to be honest. Then you add into that not all educators have been working online or know how to work online or know how to build communities online. So we have a lot of complexities that have come out of COVID-19 that have opened up a can of worms that we can, address, I think. But yeah, we do need to look at them. So the first tip I've got that I wrote in the article, I've just got down the bottom here, the term digital native doesn't mean students understand every platform, nor does it mean they understand the context of your course. They excel at certain platforms of personal choice. So when I talk a little bit more about transmedia learning, I think what is wonderful about transmedia learning and learning across multiple platforms is you're upskilling them in platforms that they will have to use in, a public relations and communication context, but they might not actually know how to learn to use, even though we just assume that they do. And my research has shown that they don't know, even though we sometimes think they do. Just a bit of background to online learning. So it's been around since the 1980s. If we look at, the invention of, the computer and the internet and that availability to the average person, but it can be argued it's been around in various forms a lot longer than that. But a key element, and that's why I've talked about asynchronous and synchronous learning, but this is something that was a bit lost in the rush for getting everything online for COVID-19. But a key element of online learning is that it's asynchronous. It's like the very tenement of what underlies it. So, a lot of the learning is done individually. It doesn't mean it can't be come back and, then shared synchronously, but it doesn't have to have every moment being synchronous. Another thing about online learning is instructional design for online learning takes 2 to 3 times the length of time for a face-to-face class. And that's if you're changing a face-to-face class to online learning. So if you're going to design it properly, you're looking at about 10 hours. And that's something, again, with COVID-19, the extraordinary number of hours required to get things online properly and integrated and in a meaningful way where students will engage takes a lot of time, a lot of thought, a lot of strategy. It's not just something you can put up a slide set and then, set and forget. And another key point is massive open online courses that Melissa mentioned. So if you haven't done one, I would recommend doing one. So MOOCs have been around for a long time and they do online learning really well. And I'd actually argue, maybe controversially, they do it better than the higher education learning management systems. Their platforms are better. They're set up for it. They understand online learning. They understand synchronous and asynchronous modes. They understand that the availability of their students is not always at the same time. And so they have unique ways of, putting in modules, putting in, discussions, where videos, where it can all come together in a very sort of seamless way. And I think learning management systems have a long way to go. I think they've made some improvements, but I still think there's a long way to go there. So the next terminology that you've probably heard around this time, blended and flipped learning. So obviously, blended learning has become lots more prominent since last year, and universities now moving more towards flexibility. And a lot of them now are saying, so we've gone back to face-to-face, but they're saying, offer it in blended. Some of us have been offering blended for quite a while. But what does it actually mean? What does blended mean? If for those of you online, if you can maybe pop in the chat box what it means to you, because I'm just curious if people have different ideas on what blended is. So maybe while you do that, I'll just keep to it talking. Adobe put up there's a graphic there that they've got that talks about what blended learning is. Now, it's pretty simple in that it's just the concepts of it, what it can involve. We've got, yes, we will be talking about the lurker. But in the new environment, I guess blended learning, my point is it can mean whatever you want it to mean. So we might all have different definitions of it. But blended learning can be in different formats. So a way I use it, for example, blended learning in one of my classes is for 2 weeks, and these weeks are sort of dispersed across a semester, I will get students using an element of my massive online open course. But they don't just do that in isolation. So they'll do the course that week and they won't come to class that week, but they have to jump online for a Twitter chat. So this is an element of, we're taking, I guess, a moment of asynchronous learning, and then I'm bringing it back to a moment of synchronous learning. So in that Twitter chat, it's only half an hour, it's short, we use a hashtag, we all jump on at the same time, and we talk about what they learned in the module. So we've gone from asynchronous to synchronous, short. Most of the students turn up. I'd say like not 95, 98% of the students turn up because they know instead of coming to a 3-hour seminar that week, hey, I have to do the modules, but then it's only half an hour and I get to connect to everyone. It's fast. They find it quite engaging, quick, and they actually get a lot of fun out of it. Now, it's not just fun because they're also learning a bit more about the platform, a platform that traditionally this generation actually don't use a lot of, which is Twitter. Now, as we know, Twitter is actually quite important for communicators. So it's actually teaching them about the platform as well. So you have, a lot of levels there. Then following that, the following week for this one of the particular modules, they come and do a crisis simulation, which is then taking the knowledge from the MOOC that they've then discussed in the Twitter chat, then back to a face-to-face synchronous moment where they're putting in action everything they've learned. So this is a very, and then they have to do a reflective paper and, assessments following that. But you can see it's quite embedded and it's a very sort of, strategic model that I just haven't locked away content in 1 week and then moved on. And this does, I think, facilitate learning and student engagement when they actually are seeing a lot of flow through in their learning from week to week. So I've put there, blended learning needs to be thought out strategically, and that's the problem with it. So the Adobe graphic there, I find sometimes what happens with blended learning is there's lots of little attempts for it, but it's still very siloed. And unfortunately, the learning management systems sort of encourage that siloed approach. Whether using Blackboard or Canvas, they aren't very dynamic platforms, so they tend to lock away material. Discussion boards are still, even though they're often touted as, but we've got discussion boards, they're still very one way, and they really don't sort of, allow that dynamic nature, the moments of learning. And this is something I talk about a lot in my Transmedia learning PhD, is students learn in moments of learning, across the course of time, not in these blocks that we have sort of predefined. You will come and learn and then we kind of expect that they will go away and then they'll come back and spend another block, when I'm trying to get students to learn continuously and think about my class continuously. And a lot using different platforms can help this. So just a note, flipped has been likened to blended and sometimes used interchangeably, but I believe flipped's quite flawed still, and current models in higher education are still those very siloed moments. So they've made an attempt, go away and do your asynchronous learning and then come back to your synchronous learning, but it's still, again, quite siloed. So another one of my tips is use resources already created. So you'll see PRIA has them, and a lot of the discipline professional groups have them. But if great podcasts on topics, MOOCs on topics that are related to your content, use them, ask them to listen to that instead of a lecture, perhaps, an hour lecture. And you can still bring in elements of that lecture, but in a more dynamic format rather than just having you speaking. I've got a link to our MOOC too, so if you want to check it out, you can. And then we have concurrent teaching, which I just think is important to mention. Now, is anyone familiar with concurrent teaching? I can't see faces, but that's all right. So you may or may not be familiar with it. If you've done it, you're familiar with it. If you haven't, you're not, probably. But what it means is you're teaching students face-to-face at the same time as teaching students online. So usually via web technology and synchronously. I believe concurrent teaching is not adequate at the moment on any level. You really need a proper distributed learning setup, and that means proper instructional design and technology that allows students to be in different locations than the instructor and face-to-face students. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Even if you have a facilitator, so someone separate who's managing your online students, I still believe it's very separate, and it's very, very difficult to engage those students at the same time, and they don't quite get the same experience. So, that was one of the Band-Aid attempts, I think, that came out of COVID-19. I don't think it's ideal at all. I think if you're going to run an online setup, you should run an online setup. And I think if you're doing face-to-face, you should do face-to-face. And because they're very different designs. I have got, though, number 10, I've put, set expectation that, there's going to be mistakes. And I think that's just it. I mean, a lot of my research has been action research, and it's been trial and error. And I've tried things with students. Some of it hasn't worked. So I've adapted things and then, tried to make it work better for them, got their feedback, tweaked it. And that's going to happen because, the online environment is so dynamic. We're getting new platforms and new technologies all the time. So, of course, playing with them is, one way to experiment. And we're still doing it. So just a little bit, I'm just looking at the time, on transmedia learning. So what is it? Essentially, it's how students learn, both formally and informally, across multiple platforms for understanding, the discipline content. And this is, the formal and informal is really important. And I think this is where higher education often has been really hung up on the formal learning, sort of almost dismissing the informal learning. And I think the informal learning can actually be just as important. I think it's an ideal way for marketing and comms PR students, as the platforms that we use for transmedia learning are the very platforms that they need to know about these days. A lot of it does come back to social media. It's not all about social media, though, but obviously, that is a heavy influence. So transmedia learning is a pedagogical approach, but it is also a discipline approach because we're in public relations. And as I mentioned before, don't assume your students know the platforms. Some do very well. Some will be experts at it. Some don't. I still get students today saying they've never been on Twitter, or they didn't know that they could use Twitter that way. So they're still very much focused on their platforms of choice, and they don't really look further. So the big thing about transmedia learning is it is synchronous and asynchronous, and it relies on those moments of time. And this is where I think it has a huge advantage, in that you can connect with your students in micro moments that does create meaningful connection. And students do want meaningful connection, I think. And it can take a lot more work and a lot more thought, because you're kind of always on and thinking about them if you're sharing content on your social media platforms for them. But I also think it adds deeper value to the content you're teaching. And it works with the LMS. So I am, happy to talk to anyone, but I can be quite critical about learning management systems at times. So it doesn't replace it. It definitely does work with it. So just a bit of background for you, stems from transmedia storytelling. If we look at transmedia learning, it's existed for about 10 years, but it's much more encompassing, I think, than the term online learning, which still assumes a silo in itself, a way of learning. I've got a definition there if you really want to delve a little bit into it. But I guess important from that is it does rely on participatory culture. So obviously we are sort of trying to build those communities online, and you can kind of choose the platform you do that. So we run some open university courses, and the platform of choice at the moment that seems to be working, we do use Facebook groups for them, but particularly when you have a small group of open university students, WhatsApp has actually become quite an intimate way that you can actually have conversations with a group of students and then also individually to sort of guide them through. And we're having quite a lot of success with that. And students actually feel more connected than if you were just, sending an email. And the key elements, so formal and informal learning, multiple platforms. So you're teaching context, you're teaching tone, you're teaching a form of code switching across platforms. So how do you use platforms differently? What is your tone? How do you adjust to your audience, which are all very important things in public relations. You're building a community online, but then you're also teaching students a part of that as well, which, as we know, is very important for our discipline. And I've just put it's where the discipline learning takes place, but it's also where the students are learning the technology. So again, I just can't stress how important that is for public relations. Number 4, I've just put build online spaces where students can share their work. So that's the very, a lot of these activities, are sort of based. So if you're looking at changing face-to-face activities, so they're sharing their work on these social media platforms, private groups I do recommend, showing, telling and responding activities, where they're sharing what they have created. So you get that collaboration still that students can actually see what each other have done. So key platforms, I've just got, you're connecting students where they already are. So that's why I use Facebook groups, despite, there's been a lot of students aren't on Facebook anymore. Actually, they are. That's where they get their news, and it's back. They weren't getting their news. They might have actually left, but it's back now, so we can be safe that they're still there. And they are there, and I'll be often more likely to connect with my students on a Facebook group than I would if I send an email. A lot of them aren't reading their emails, believe it or not. A lot of them only go to Blackboard, sometimes, sadly, once a week if we're lucky. So I can connect with them a lot quicker on the platforms that I use. It's about knowing your students too, so knowing where they are and how you can. With Instagram, I get my students to do live takeovers, so this is a great way to develop their storytelling and content marketing skills, so I think that's really important. And, it's also developing their creativity. Some students are amazing at this, and, professionals and others sort of need to do a bit more work. So that seeing what others do as well is very important. Twitter, as mentioned, you have great platform for taking asynchronous learning and turning it into a synchronous moment, and it's that small moment of time again. And you can build on your asynchronous learning through Twitter, which is great. Simulations, which obviously can bring in active learning, and then reflections. I've got a little graphic here that sort of shows you for one of my units how I sort of blend it all together. So that's your blended learning model. But as you can see, I mean, it is, it's something you need to think about how it all sort of will flow. So it's not something you can just go, this week I'm going to do this. You really do want that connection through all the weeks. And you can also do this for work integrated learning. So I've got an example here of a work placement unit that I think Transmedia learning is just perfect for. And in fact, my PhD focuses on work integrated learning, the Transmedia learning model, in this context. Because work integrated learning, you have a lot less time with students, and sometimes in this case particularly, it's not a face-to-face unit. And I think a lot of students often, some of the will units sort of just say, go out and get a placement, off you go, and that's your work integrated learning. But what we've done is really looked at a deeply embedded model where you're still very connected to the student. You really do guide them. You're a mentor. You use the transmedia learning model for them to still share their material, and that's through blogs, digital portfolios, virtual poster session, Facebook Lives. There's a lot of material that draws them together, so they still feel connected. Because I think the problem with a lot of internships is students can feel quite disconnected at a time that actually is quite high anxiety, really, when they're going out into the workplace, often for the first time, and they can feel very alone, even though they will have a workplace supervisor. There's not a lot of connection to uni, so this model can really sort of bring back that connection to uni and the uni learnings, and I think you know have a lot more positive outcome for their unit learning outcomes. I've got here, students like to learn where they are, so I've already mentioned that one, but yeah, just have a look at where your students are, and really do not dismiss those small moments of learning, because they can be very valuable. I've just put here, this is postgrad students, so some examples of how you can draw that together in a transmedia learning way. So looking at digital portfolio content creation, but live creation of that in a safe space, blogging and podcasting, where students are sharing their material. And blogs still, blogs have been around for a very long time, but I think in learning, I think there's still a wonderful platform for that, building that participatory culture, but also having students reflect in a less, formal manner. For marketing and PR students, obviously, we're getting them to develop their skills in writing again, different tones, different platforms. It's much more relaxed and personable. But then it's also helping other students understand. And, I don't think there's anything wrong with asking students to comment on a number of blogs for grades or accreditation. They will do it because they have to, but then they will actually find value in it because they've been forced to. And I think if you give them a guide, the important thing is to give them a guide on how to respond, in that they can't just say, that's great, I really enjoyed reading your blog, it was wonderful. That they actually have to sort of describe what they liked about it, describe how they had a similar experience, talk about an outcome that came about it for them, and in some ways give them a bit of a roadmap on how to respond, and then they can actually be quite meaningful responses, and help them along the way to produce more engagement. Katarina's just got a question here, so I'm just going to say, she's got, thank you for mentioning the lurker, because I don't think I talked about it too much. Is there a role for the lurker beyond pandemics, or do you find lurking particularly links to those levels of heightened anxiety we've experienced over 12 months? Yeah, the big thing is, don't dismiss the lurker. And my research has come out and shown this, is that there are students that, yeah, social media and online can be a great equalizer for introverts and extroverts. However, on social media platforms in particular, there can be students that just don't engage. And this has come out of my research. So I've deliberately asked them, I've said to them, so if you're on a social media platform, did you, listen to my podcast? Did you read the blogs? Did you look at the news items I put up? And their answer would be yes. And then I'd say, okay, did you engage with them, like them, or comment on them? And sometimes, quite often, the answer would be no, I didn't. But then what they would say after that, they'd say, but I don't do that anyway on social media. So they're very consistent with their actions, even if it's, social versus academics, in that they will, no, I don't really engage a lot on social media, but I am on there. And just because they haven't engaged in a way that we would, and this is where I think the metrics we use, it's like some of you will know, Blackboard engagement metrics, you know, who's not engaging. What does that actually mean? So if a student's on my social media platforms, they're listening to my videos, they're watching my videos, they're perhaps looking at my news articles I post up and thinking about them before they come to class, and they might engage in class. They're reading the blog posts, but not commenting. Does that make that any less valuable for them? And I don't think it does. So I think we need to sort of re-look at sometimes how students use the platforms and just not make assumptions about, you know, likes and comments. And this is very similar for discussion boards as well. Some key learnings here. Students want social to be social. So I guess the big thing is you're going to have groups. Don't use too formal language. You know, try to, I've got the chat box up here. Sorry, it's just come up for me. Don't use too formal language in social media groups. So mix up your content. So, you know, show a little bit of yourself and perhaps what's going on, or some amusing stuff that happened in classes. You know, if it's online, if there's something online that, you know, was amusing, it is learning, but I think social content does help build the dynamic of the community. Something new I'm trying is asking some students to lead the social media discussions. So rather than me forcing, because, you know, we have the dynamic of the lecturer and the student, which, you know, sometimes students can be reluctant, is really getting some students to sort of lead that and show the way there. Social media and online can be a great equalizer, as I mentioned, but just be careful how we look at that. And in that, I'll just say, one thing that hasn't been mentioned that has come out of my research is it can also be a great equalizer for international students. So I've found some of my students that are painfully shy in class, you know, it's just not in their culture to sort of talk and offer comments, and they're not comfortable doing it. Online feel much more comfortable, and they've actually come out when I've had interviews with them and spoken with them and said that, and said, I just feel much more comfortable online. I feel, you know, much more at ease and more willing to engage. And I think that can be a real positive. The other big thing is you need to look at how you teach students how to learn in a transmedia way. So they've been very, very used to the siloed approach of the Blackboard LMS. You know, all the information is locked away. You go for sort of finite moments of learning, and then you walk away and you forget about it. So sort of showing them how the platforms work together, sort of getting them used to the idea of different moments in time of learning in different moments in time. And students have said this to me, or when you post news articles or post a prompt about something we talked about that week, it got me thinking about the content outside of a time that I would normally, you know, think about class content. And I think that's really valuable. Those comments really hearten me that I'm doing the right thing in the learning, that they are now, and they go, I'll be watching a TV show and I thought about, you know, what we learned, and then they'll post about that. So that really shows to me then they're taking their knowledge and applying it, and I think that's really, really valuable. Some key elements there. I don't want to go on too much. I just want to, I want to look at some of these questions. Digital content should be shorter. Facebook Lives are wonderful. You know, Facebook has so many issues, don't get me started. But one thing I really love is Facebook Lives in my group. Students love them. Students can watch them later. They're really quick to do, much quicker than, you know, doing a Zoom and then having to upload it to your LMS. Students can comment and ask questions that you can quickly answer later, and then all the students can see them, rather than being locked away in an LMS. This is one of the wonderful things about social media that I think some of the software needs to be able to harness. So yeah, I highly value Facebook Lives, and if you're not using them in your teaching, you might want to think about it, because they're great. Even just a end of the week synopsis sort of thing can be really valuable. And I've already said that. So number 9, I've just put, this is an opportunity for educators to upskill their knowledge, but also students. So it's works both ways, I think. And I think, you know, if you see it as a journey together, I think there can be really great outcomes. Okay, so moving to questions. I'm just going to look at this chat because I haven't. Katarina's got, yeah, blended learning means learning different paths, opportunities students engage. Yeah, absolutely, not a one size fits all. And I think that's a good point, because I think that comes back to asking your students as well at the beginning of the semester, how do you want to learn? How do you want to do this? You know, here are the platforms we've got. How often do you want to meet up? I mean, you know, when it's face to face, obviously you're still going to meet up the majority of the time, but you know, sort of defining it for them and getting them involved in that process, I think, can be really valuable. Current approx 15-year-olds are on Facebook as much. Yeah, it is interesting. I'm not sure what's going to happen. I think a lot of people have left too because of the whole news debacle. A lot of us are quite upset with Facebook and with the government. Am I allowed to say that? And yeah, look, you know, the platforms are going to change, and I think that's the key that I'm trying to get through with my research, my PhD, is the tenements of transmedia learning shouldn't change, but the platforms will change. And, you know, that will require flexibility and looking at how you are sharing your content. Do we have any other questions from people? I think we've only got Catherine, Katarina and Nicole online, so maybe not.
Bridget, just while people are gathering their thoughts, and Maddie, if you also maybe want to open or elevate the guests or the attendees so they can ask a question verbally, that would be great. But Bridget, I had one for you. You mentioned earlier about building online communities, which is obviously a critical part, particularly if there are elements of a unit that involve group work. What are your tips or insights into how you can create and form communities in that online learning environment?
Yeah, so this comes back to your instructional design. It really does. I mean, to build an online community, you can't just say, hey, we've got a Facebook group, we've got a WhatsApp group, join in. So it comes back to, I think you've got to lead. So you've got to lead in, this is, I'm going to show you how I share information. I'm going to show you how I collaborate on this platform. It also comes back to, as I mentioned, being social as well. So not social in a, I had, you know, a few too many wines on the weekend, but, you know, sharing, I guess, those moments that are relevant but a little bit more funny, or, you know, one thing I do with students is they all seem to, we have a lot of shared love of dogs, so, you know, we just sort of share some things that, you know, students will engage with. I tried to think back to when I was a student and things that might make them laugh. But as I said, I think getting those a few student leaders in that is imperative. When I moved to the getting students, so the Instagram lives, I get them to take it over. So for our university Instagram page, they actually run them from week to week, and, you know, sometimes they do some quite interesting stuff, creative stuff. So it's that ownership as well. And I tell them that, I say, this is not my space, this is your space. So, you know, you use that. But it's consistency too. And sometimes, as we all know, as educators, that is hard because we are all very, very busy and flat out, and we also have personal lives. But you do kind of need that consistency and that continual, as I said, those moments of connection. That's what's important. Being human, that's another thing. And I think during COVID, I saw it. I think there was more of a shift in higher education to move to being a bit more human, which was nice to see in some ways. Katarina's just got here, what are some alternatives to Facebook? Yeah, this is a really good question. So I think WhatsApp, but for small groups. So WhatsApp's worked really well. We had great success with Google Plus, and I think the funny thing was Google Plus, I think the people that used it the most were educators, and then they closed it down. So if they have, if something similar comes up, I'd be interested if anyone knows. But yeah, I think you could use any platform, to be honest. It's a matter of telling your class, this is what we're using and this is how we're going to use it. So, but they're going to be used in different ways. I haven't seen anything alternative to Facebook yet in terms of a group that you can kind of share news in a dynamic social media way, but there could be something out there. But then again, that would be, hey students, download this app, and there's always a hurdle when they have to download something. So that is, something we've got to look at. Oh yes, I've lost all content shared. Yeah, absolutely. It was kind of devastating. I think a lot of us lost a lot of important content that we'd used, and we've kind of felt angry and, a bit sort of just that the rug can be pulled out from us like that. And I think, well, obviously news sites felt that way too, and showed, I guess, a great flaw in all of us relying on one platform too much. So yeah, I mean, should we be brave and venture onto TikTok? I don't know. I think I've seen some pretty ethically dubious stuff on TikTok. So I have, but then again, I have on Facebook too. TikTok is, it could be used. It could be used, absolutely. The big hurdle too, I haven't said, it's less so these days, but some students will just say, I do not want to be on that platform. And I think they have a right to say that. I think it gets increasingly difficult though when we're in public relations and communication and marketing, where you're going to have to use those platforms in profession. So it's like, okay, you don't want to be on that platform, but how are you going to learn about it then? So that's always my argument back to them. But, there will be at times difficulties with that. Twitter has seemed to remain stable, so that could also be going back to Twitter for sharing news. It's not as user-friendly in some ways or as visual, but they're getting it a bit better. But, the class hashtag has become, for our chats, it's very valuable, and I do find that valuable. Yes, the news is back. I just saw. What do you do for those, objections to being on a platform? Well, and that's it. I just think it's the discipline. Conscious objections to being on a platform. I mean, Twitter. I mean, the trouble is, I mean, what I'd say to them, but you can't go into a workplace and say, oh, well, I'm not going to put up, a recent announcement on Twitter because I don't want to be on it. I mean, it's part and parcel of the job. So very difficult. If they want to do that, they're probably going to have a tricky time in the workplace. But yeah, any other questions?
Just another one from me, Bridget. So
Yeah.
from your research and your findings, are there any things that have stood out that you think could be plugged into or applied to practitioners? So my thinking is particularly around having communities or team groups that may not be working face-to-face anymore, that might go away, do a few days at home and then come back together. So are there any sort of transferable findings that you have identified or that stand out for you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I was a team leader, I'd probably set up a private group with my team, and yeah, I'd do, you might have your Zoom catch-ups, but then, in keeping the team together, use the group as a sharing what you're working on, quick Facebook Live if you have thought about something and you just want some input. And then people can sort of respond when they can watch it. Yeah, so I guess it's a shift in thinking about how we communicate, ironically. So coming back to, was it Catherine? I love the idea of micro moments of connection, and I guess that's what these groups allow, even in industry, is we sometimes do forget about those micro moments of connection, and some of those things can be locked away between certain team members if it's just an email thread. So yeah, the group things, some people are using Slack, and in fact, well, there's another platform. So some educators have moved to Slack because of the Facebook thing, and they've moved away from Facebook groups and gone to Slack. Industry uses it, so it's not a bad idea, but it is a platform. I have looked at it and I have used it for some projects I've run, but it is a platform you have to get everyone on, a level of education on how to use it. It's reasonably intuitive, but not completely. So yeah, I guess with any of those things, it's kind of like, okay, sitting down as a team, what do we want to use? How do we want to communicate? We're going to use this one, and trying to get everyone on board, I guess, in using the same platform. I think there's no more questions.
Well, if there's no more questions or comments, I'd just like to thank all of the participants for joining us today and for contributing with your comments and your questions. And particularly to you, Bridget, for being so generous with your time and also sharing your learnings and your insights. And I think there's some key things that we'll all take away from today. For me, I guess the key standout was those learning moments and creating those opportunities for students and even practitioners to integrate learning into their life and have those light bulb moments, as you mentioned, when they're sitting there watching TV or just reflecting on some content that you've shared with them. So thank you to everyone for today. And just a call out that these are monthly sessions. So the next one will be in late March. So keep an eye out on the PRIA website for that. And once again, thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to Bridget as well.
Thank you.